because the players are Pacific, is that those who identify as rainbow and LGBT are also Pacific as well. Because what we'll now see when we go onto social media, the conversations that we'll be having in our families, in our cars, in our churches, and the places we love to congregate is that there's going to be this debate. And one of the debates will be around absolutely supporting those players. But on the flip side of supporting those players, people are going to feel like they need someone to blame for all the rhetoric that is going to go around. And if you are Rainbow and Pacific and you belong to those communities, religious, family or cultural communities, you're going to feel like there's no place for you to belong.
You've said it is Pacific communities who suffer the greatest consequences of these sporting and religious cultural expression debates. What do you mean by that?
I think that these Pacific young men who have a right to express their religious beliefs, and I absolutely support that, I'm a human rights worker. What I do get concerned about, though, is that Pacific young men are being the poster boys for something that maybe they didn't sign up for. Maybe they were uncomfortable because of their religious beliefs not to wear the jersey. And all of a sudden, I worry that they're going to be co-opted by bigger powers, by people that have some really firm views about a whole bunch of different issues that they're going to fall into now. And I don't know if that's what they signed up for. I worry for them because mass media and the general public, as they debate this issue, will start to talk about, Pacific people and about their religion and about their culture in ways that really aren't nuanced, in ways that people don't really understand. So, for instance, people will be criticizing the church. And while I absolutely acknowledge that the church and colonization has done a job on our people in terms of, us adopting these Western and colonial ways of thinking that deny our inherent identities and who we are, our sexual identities and our gender identities. So while there is all that, and that's the role that the church has played in that situation, what we forget is that for many of us, the church has really played a really important part and has been there when other people haven't been able to be there.
Well, you once played a very active role in your church and then you stepped down. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just say that, I grew up in the church. That's what my family did day in, day out, and also on the weekends. And when you grow up in that system, I learned really early on that it was not okay to be gay. I learned that that's what I thought, that that's not what God wanted for you. I read the Bible. There's 6 Bible verses that they often use. They're called clobber texts that sort of say that God doesn't like or support homosexuality or diverse genders and sexualities. And so that's what I grew up in. So to the point that I eventually became a pastor, but I also spent 15 years in what is called conversion practices or conversion therapy. And these are practices that purport to be able to change your sexuality, your gender. And I put myself right in the middle of all of those. And unfortunately, by the time I got to age 40, I realized that after 15 years of those practices, that it was not possible at all to change my sexuality. But I'd learned that the hard way. I learned that after I started to suffer depression, anxiety, and actually was thinking about taking my life. It was really hard for me because I was a pastor as well. So on one hand, I was experiencing this on my own. And on the other hand, here I was, meant to be sort of like a shepherd and a pastor to people. But I think it just hit that moment where I realized that I can't do this. And not only can I not do this, but actually I don't think it works. So at that point, I stopped being a pastor. No one told me that I had to resign. I already knew that the church wouldn't support that. And so I left willingly. And since leaving then, I've come to learn about a God and biblical interpretations that are more inclusive, more expansive, that have allowed me to accept myself, and have to say more, and I've never been happier.
Non-Christians have labelled the players who took part in the boycott as hypocrites because they said they didn't bother boycotting over sponsorship around gambling and alcohol. What do you think? Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. It's a question that really makes sense to a lot of people outside the church. They're like, oh, aren't all these things bad? But unfortunately, if you've grown up in the church, though no one says it, you learn about a sort of a hierarchy of sins. And there are some sins that seem to be a little bit more acceptable than others. Now, some people will say that no sin is acceptable, but I've often found that, there's something else going on here, and that's the cultural wars as well. And in these cultural wars, sexuality is often a really hot topic. And I think it's an issue that really pushes a lot of people's buttons. And so I think that's why people might ignore gambling, they might ignore alcohol, and they might see sexuality as the most, offensive type sin. And so again, that is the challenge for church leaders to think about. Why is it that we might ignore these other manner of sins and this one? So I think there's a lot of sort of paradoxes that are clear to people outside the church, but if you've grown up in the church, it makes a lot of sense.
You said it's time we unite as a wider community to have an internal family conversation. What kind of conversation needs to happen?
I would say religious leaders, community leaders, don't you recognize that that we are being co-opted for a conversation that we didn't start, and that's much bigger than us? I sincerely think about those players at the moment, and I think not only of them, but I think of their families when they start to read, all the public, conversation that's going to go on about them, and I feel like that's going to have a wear and tear on them. I think about their finances, I think about their wallet as well, and it just seems sad to me that we have been caught up in this situation when I kind of feel like that's someone else's battle. The other thing I would also say to us in terms of having this whānau conversation is that these debates always end up with rainbow people being the casualty. And so every time we go into this debate, before long, people are going to turn on us, our own family members, our own churches, our own friendships, friends sometimes, and they're going to blame us for it. And I want to say to religious leaders, is that right that happens? Don't we have cultural values and even religious values that might make us think that we need to protect, and we need to awhi people and we need to bring them in, rather than deciding that all of a sudden we don't belong when it comes to a sporting issue, a sporting debate. We're bigger than sports, we're bigger than political debate, and that's the type of conversation I want us to have.